Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be talking with Matt Ehret, who I'm a big fan of. I've been following him for a year or two now. I can't keep up with all his output, though. I mean, it seems like he's got a new video or essay or article or book, and along with his wife, who's doing the same thing. And I am retired, but if I was the type of retired who was sitting in a rocking chair, I would watch his stuff all the time. But unfortunately, fortunately, I should say, I'm very busy with a lot of projects. I don't have time to watch them all, but I try to get as much as I can. And the impression I get from watching all these is that, God, Matt and his wife, they seem to know everything relevant that's happened for the last 2,000 years in the history of the world. It seems uncanny. In fact, I'm wondering if Matt, you have a photographic memory and a speed reader or something. I can't understand how you can do this, really, honestly. Is there some trick or secret you could tell us about how you both are able to produce so much quality stuff all the time?
Oh, thanks, Tom. I don't really know exactly. We're certainly nothing special, and I think if anything, I read slow, and people often ask me like, do I have speed reading tricks? And I think the primary advice I tend to give people who ask me that question is just read slowly, and I often reread pages, but read actively. So when you're reading, don't try to just assume that what you're reading is true, but think about the mind of the composer of the work that you're reading, and think, how are they thinking? What are they challenging themselves with? And write questions to yourself as you're reading a book, right? So that it's more of an active living process,
Mm-hmm.
and you're accompanying the person on their own journey. And also, what are you reading, right? Are you reading, try to when you go to, select what restaurant you want to eat. Ideally, you want to try to select not only tasty food, but also nutritious food. So try to
Yes.
select good
Yeah, of course.
nutritional value and
Yeah.
choices for your intellectual diet. So look for people who made discoveries. Look for people who actually influenced positively world history in a good way, and could walk the walk, right? So
Mm-hmm.
zero in on those people rather than the many
Versions of
books that are
history.
written by commentators, opinionators who didn't really influence anything, or if anything, did dampened the potential for humanity by virtue of the life that they chose to live, or the ideas that they chose to promote. They often actually didn't contribute, but caused a dampening effect. So don't try to reduce our consumption of those things and maximize our consumption of good things. And then
Yeah.
we just find that a little bit of the good will be awoken inside of us too. And I attribute that to anything good that I do, is just finding good role
Okay.
models and good people throughout history before I lived, in many cases,
I see.
to try
Well,
to be inspired by.
that seems like common sense, what you're suggesting. And I would also add, like, it's really important to question everything and to not be attached to beliefs. Would you agree with
Mm.
that?
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah, be flexible.
um, yeah. One thing I'd like to, well, I should mention that you've got a number of books out, you and your wife, and some new ones that we'll post at the bottom, and also three websites, I think, and some other areas where your work goes out. We'll try to put that at the bottom so everybody can check in with you.
Okay.
Um, so I wanted to start off with, would you agree that humanity is in a battle for freedom, as everything that is happening seems to be for the purpose of capturing humanity in an inescapable trap a la 1984? Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Oh, good. I was hoping
I
you
could go along
would.
with that.
Okay. Then let me follow it up with uh can would you, from having watched and listened to your comments for a while now, I came away with the understanding that the people who are, whoever they are, doing this seem to be ideologues of Nazism and eugenics. Would you agree with that? Because I've seen some of, both of you have written a lot about that, shows how the West really supported Hitler in his rise and even during the war, and um, and that they have been infiltrated into the United States and other countries
Mm,
since the war.
mm.
and
Hmm.
and it seems like the ones who are really at the top have this kind of mentality. Would you agree with
Mm,
that?
yeah, yeah, I'd go along with
Yeah,
that too. Yeah.
because I don't know if you can briefly substantiate that claim, because for some people it's too shocking for them, I guess, to wrap their head around. But you have provided in your videos and papers a lot of convincing proof that this is the case. Is it possible you could mention a few of those without going too deeply into it? Because there's a lot
Sure.
of other topics I want to talk about.
Yeah, okay. I guess the two ways I would look at this is number one, to redefine what it was that Nazism actually was. Since we all know what the word is, hell, in Germany, they know what it is to such an extent that you're not even allowed to showcase Nazi symbolism, even on books like my wife's book, which features a Nazi symbol. It's called the Empire in which the Black Sun never set, but only to basically warn the world in the context of her book how Anglo-American Wall Street, City of London power brokers crafted and nurtured the rise of fascism in the 20th century internationally, both in Germany as well as in Italy and abroad. But we're not allowed to sell that book in Germany or in all of Europe, actually. There's actually,
Oh,
Amazon has said, no, there's laws in Germany that are extending now to all of Europe that you're not allowed to sell anything which features Nazi symbols, even if you're warning about the truth of Nazism and you're not promoting it. Um, so you're, but so it's obviously something very present in the minds of people. It's
could,
still so traumatizing.
yeah, would it be worth it for you to take that symbol off that book so you could sell it in Europe? No?
No, 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 it's fine.
Oh,
um, but people can buy digital copies. All that to say,
oh, okay.
um, there's still a trauma where people are walking around with the shock and trauma of what happened 80 years ago in
Yeah.
Germany and abroad, but they have no idea what the causes were of what made Hitlerism in the first place, and thus they don't see that they're actually repeating a lot of the same problems that were faced back then. I mean, Germany, to this very point, is just declared that they're at war with Russia. And Baerbock just gave a speech where she said, "Yeah, we are at war with Russia," and it's like, yeah, that worked out for you really good last time, lady. And she's speaking not just for the Germans, but for all of NATO. I mean, that's not something we declared. They're supporting actual Azov battalion, swastika wearing, Wolf's Angle wearing militias in Ukraine. Who, I mean, I think most of your viewers have probably seen this over the past 8 years, the rise of these like paramilitary groups and Nazi ideologues and romantics who have been used by the United States since, well, before 2014 when they engaged in their coup. But ever since then, and the Germans, the Americans who said never again will we ever let such things happen. That was the banter after World War II. Well, here we are. We're providing weapons, tanks, Leopard tanks, other things to actual Nazis to go to war with Russia. So all that to say, we're repeating some nasty history. So why? I think if people don't know what the Nazism was, and number one, as you just alluded to, it is demonstrable that Hitlerism, Nazism would not have been successful were it not for massive infusions of Wall Street and City of London assistants. Prescott Bush, from the patriarch of the Bush family as a dynasty, worked with Brown Brothers Harriman, overseeing loans to the Nazi war machine in 1932-33 when the party was bankrupt. They had fallen from power. They weren't going to come back. The people of Germany didn't like them. And Hitler was contemplating suicide. Were it not for the infusion of millions of dollars from Wall Street banks, he probably would have ended his life and made the world a lot better. Now that didn't end up happening. He got the support he needed. Rockefeller Standard Oil provided, even during World War II, about half of the petrochemical supplies and necessities required for the raw materials of the Nazi war machine to carry out its battle, both against Russia and the Allies more generally.
Was that surreptitious? Did they do that surreptitiously, or they said there was never any? They did that with impunity, right? There was never. They actually did that during the war, and
During the war,
nobody, and they got away with that.
well, yeah,
And
and they would often
it's
use, like front groups. They would create like a subsidiary based in like some Axis allied country, but it was wholly owned by the directorship of the Standard Oil groups. And books have been written about this. It's sort of like become just a bit of a trivia truism that people just throw about, just to act like they're so smart and how much they know. But it's like, no, these institutions still control so much of today's world. Like, you're not putting two and two together. Prescott Bush for Union Banking Corporation got tried in the United States and at the end of 1941 for trading with the enemy, for continuing after the U.S. went into war with Germany, to continue to do business to support the Nazi machine.
Right.
So
And
all that to say, you have.
Was he penalized for that? Did he go to jail?
Well, they confiscated Union banking assets, and for the duration of the war, he was a bit of a political untouchable. But then the second Franklin Roosevelt died, and Roosevelt's key allies were purged, all under the McCarthy, well, what became McCarthyism, but the J. Edgar Hoover dictatorship of the Red Scare that began the second FDR was dead. All of his allies who understood the Anglo-American fascist machine embedded within the United States itself were all labeled commies, were destroyed, some were assassinated, many were just untouchables of the caste system.
Yeah.
And then the enemies of America, who were like waiting as vipers in the wings within the State Department as part of the proto-deep state, took control over FDR's dead body. And people like Prescott Bush were rewarded by becoming senator, and his family was rewarded with becoming a little family dynasty with a couple of kids who became president.
And also the Dulles brothers the one taking over the CIA and subverting the whole thing right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean,
he had contacts. They had contacts with Hitler beforehand, right?
Oh yeah, Allen Dulles headed the Barron office of the CIA and was very much colluding with some of the worst elements of the Nazi machine, and played the key role in Operation Gladio. That was something that came about later on when NATO was created, as a branch of NATO that involved preserving the different high-level Nazi assets and Italian fascist and Spanish fascist unrepentant ideologues, and absorb them into the MI6 CIA apparatus, again overseen by NATO later on, which were then put to work carrying out terrorist assassinations or just assassinations against leaders of the West who were inclined to want to find points of collaboration with Russia or China, or promote development of African countries. And I'm here talking about Dag Hammarskjöld, an early UN Secretary General who was assassinated in one of these Gladio operations when his plane was blown up. He was a major friend of many leaders of African countries who aspired to have industrial development, and he wanted to help them, so he had to be taken out. Enrico Mattei, the Italian industrialist from one of the biggest Italian industrialists, who was again a very moral figure, who was working with South American and African leaders to help them develop sovereign hydroelectric dams and advanced power facilities so that they could modernize. He was taken out. That was unacceptable. JFK,
the African
wrote a book.
Lumumba and some of those African
Lumumba
leaders
was taken out 3 days before he was supposed to meet with JFK, and Lumumba was a Pan-Africanist of very high quality, working with people like Kwame Nkrumah as well, who all felt and understood the nature of this battle very clearly. So yeah, you have all of these Nazis who are just absorbed into the machine. Part of what they're also doing is carrying out bombings, terrorist activity against the population of Europe and North America, controlling sort of but they are they actually are like ideologue Maoist Leninist anarchist cells within the United States, within Canada, like the FLQ, the Weather Underground, were being shaped by these agents, the Red Brigades in Europe.
Wait a minute.
Yeah,
the Weather Underground, you say, was shaped by this? Because I remember them, and that's a surprise to hear.
The Weather Underground.
How can you substantiate
they work together with the FLQ? So the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec, it was all these like liberation movements with again Maoist Leninists, often ideological sort of grouping that would control them as hives of often young, useful idiots who didn't really know what the hell they were doing half the time, but they were being handled. So the FLQ, I wrote actually a chapter in one of my recent books on the RCMP and Pierre Elliott Trudeau's overseeing of the FLQ terrorist groups in Quebec that launched hundreds of letter bombs throughout the 1960s to just create an atmosphere of panic and terror in the population that would then run back into the arms of the state that would then protect you from the big bad or the shadowy terrorist forces. That was what the Red Brigades were also useful for in Europe, in Italy, and their groups in Germany as well. Is just to create a climate of fear and terror so the citizenry couldn't really think clearly, and they would then go to the state to give protection. But the states were becoming more captured, as we saw with JFK's murder, and then afterwards, increasingly the deep state took control. So in the case
what about right now and what's happening in Iran? I know it's a complicated situation, but do you have an opinion about the protest that's going on there? Because I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, no, in Iran, it's there was a Brookings Institute operation, a white paper which became policy in 2009, and it overlapped with RAND reports, RAND planning on different color revolutionary activities that could be done to destabilize governments that are troublesome to U.S. foreign policy. The focus of this particular Brookings study was on Persia and on Iran specifically, and Iran has been targeted for destabilization via color revolutionary activities, utilizing human rights, other things, and that's sort of what Soros has been doing for a long time. That's what they tried in 2009 with the Green Revolution in Iran. It didn't really work too well, but they tried it. Soros money and front groups were backing it. National Endowment for Democracy, things like Elon Musk played a key role later on in the current operation with Starlink satellites that are providing coordinating technologies for all of the various groups that are being cultivated to become, again, destabilizers. Iran has problems, but they don't. I mean, they are. We are being lied to. I mean, in my research,
well,
what we're seeing in Iran is coordinated by the West.
That brings me to another question. It's like I've noticed in a lot of your work that you put out that you put a lot of faith in China and Russia and Iran and India, in that whole group that is standing up against the hegemony of the United States or the oligarchs. And it seems like all of those countries are authoritarian countries to a large degree. And so I'm wondering how you can have much faith in that, or how do you see that?
Well, I mean, in terms of China or Russia, who are the biggest players in terms of this Eurasian partnership, Iran has increasingly come on board with a variety of trade and security deals with both China and Russia, and in a very important way. India is increasingly on board too, but a little bit slower going because of the nature of their system. But well, I don't think the word authoritarian and democracy have gotten really abused and oversimplified. And I think, when I look at what's really controlling governments of the so-called free and democratic West, it's not the people. I mean, no. We got a very... Huh?
No, they're both bad on both sides, clearly. But I mean, to have our hope to block this totalitarian takeover, this hegemony over the whole world, is to have faith in these authoritarian governments. Seems kind of
well, I don't see them as authoritarian. The word authoritarian to me doesn't mean what it used to. It's like, what is authoritarian?
Okay, like for instance, in China, I know that they have cameras everywhere, and that the freedom varies depending on what your situation is in China. But in general, there's a lot less freedom in China than you might find in the United States, and I don't think of the United States as a free country. Would you agree with that?
The second part I agree with. I don't find that the United States is a free country. The first part, though, is a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. In the sense that there are cameras, yes. The question is, what's the purpose of the camera, and in what way does it impact the lives of the people living in a country that you have the cameras?
Well, what about the system they have for if you're for instance if you say something bad about the communists, you're out of luck, right? And they have that whole system tied in with the cameras. That's from what I've heard from people who who are Chinese.
Well, there's difference between people who are Chinese and people who live in China as well.
No, I'm talking about people
Because
who live in China.
yeah, I know quite a. I've got hundreds of contacts in China, and I mean the sense that I'm getting from those who are living there is not like, number one, the CIA's put out a lot of messaging to try to give across the idea that China is this advanced, top-down, centralized social credit system where everybody is
Mhm.
surveilled in a slave state.
Right.
That's like marketed, and successfully so, to the left and the right together,
Right.
mainstream and increasingly also alternative. There's
And you're
no
saying it's not
centralized social
true.
credit system. Brian Burlatek did a great takedown of this whole thing. There is no singular social credit system anywhere in China. You have, and number two, there's hundreds of protests in China every day. That's part of the way that they've operated for decades and decades. Is part of the way it works is it's a protest culture. So every time that there's something that is being done dysfunctionally by a municipal, a provincial, or any other representative who's assigned a task to play a role in carrying out whether development or whatever else, if they don't do their job well, there's constant surveying, constant protests that then are messaged and actually taken seriously by the government itself. So there's this back and forth between the masses and the leadership that is not there just to be sort of icing or glaze or something. They actually, you can see right now, there's a track record. I've written about this. 4.6 million Chinese Communist officials, Chinese Communist Party officials, have been punished, in some cases jailed, imprisoned, demoted, kicked out of the party over the past 10 years of the anti-corruption crackdown, for one thing. And thousands have been fired just for simply the fact that they did not meet the needs of the people that they were assigned to satisfy, as far as building
Okay.
rail, managing a transportation grid, whatever, that they
What
were
about
told that that was their job.
what about Russia? Could you say the same thing for
Well, hold
Russia?
on. Well, it's two very
It's
different
very
systems in that
different.
sense.
Yeah, but
Uh,
still.
China. So the first thing about China is, number one, it's a meritocracy. It's,
Oh, yeah.
you don't have to be part of like a closed family structure to become a leader in China. They have constant, for example, the testing system. Anybody, even in the lowest so-called peasant class, has access to the same tests, and if you demonstrate excellence in terms of your understanding of classical studies and basic logic and creativity, and a lot of it is you have to compose poetry as well, you will then be able to rise and excel, even compared, and you're going to be given the same opportunities to do that even from somebody who's born in a family of elites. So
I see.
there's a lot more openness to access governing situations based on your merits, your capacities, and to get to a governing position of, like, let's say you want to be part of the Politburo of 7, very hard to do, or the 27 person other standing committee, a bit lower than that, or there's 96 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a lot of people, but to become part of that, you have to become
Deserve
an
it in a way.
engineer. You have to know engineering, real world skills, farming. Like, for example, Xi Jinping had to, since the 80s, he had to first demonstrate aptitudes. Well, first having worked for years in a farming community, then managing a little local region of a rural district, and then working up, and then becoming a representative of a province, which he had to do for
Hmm.
2 provinces at a certain point, and then he went federal.
Yeah.
But in China, unlike the West, like in the West, we've got a culture of mediocrity where you just have to be trained in law or economics or some abstract, useless art of sophistry in order to become a president, or just be part of the right, skull and bones family, and you're
Yeah.
good.
No. Yeah. I
Whereas,
agree.
or Zelensky,
Okay.
he just has to be a good
No.
comedian
Okay.
and play the piano with his pants down. Whereas in China, they got the biggest quantity of engineers who've built things in the real world, who are part
Yeah.
of their leadership.
Hmm.
So it's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And
I
number
get it. I
two,
get
I'd say,
it. Yeah.
yeah. So number
It's.
two, I'd say,
I
like,
get the idea. Go ahead.
yeah. And then on the other level, the question of freedom is important, because you're not punished for criticizing the government. As I said about the protest culture, it is big. It's really just, if you are the only people who get punished for doing things that are against the government, or is if you are a high-level person in the Chinese Communist Party administration with responsibilities of management, and if they find that you are on if you have a PayPal account tied to a CIA front group, which many have been found to be, and John Bolton even complained that since Xi Jinping's crackdown, they've had fewer and fewer assets to work with inside China, then you will be purged. Like, you will have your job opportunities taken down quite a bit. But there's not really, beyond hearsay and anecdotal statements made from often people in the West, there's actually not really any instances that your average citizen who just complains of the government is ever really punished. It doesn't happen. It's just, if you are a tool of the West, yeah, that's a different story. Or a Soros asset, it's a different story.
Okay, I get it. You made that very clear. Thank you. I want to ask you what your opinion is about the WHO's bid for permission from every country to be able, so that they can dictate when there's a pandemic and how all countries must comply with their orders, like, for example, vaccine mandates.
Yeah, there's a fight over civilization right now. Yeah, the Bill Gates death cultists who have chosen the WHO is one of, not the only, but one of their primary globalist bodies or instruments to try to, like, infuse controls onto nations of the earth. They want that. They want to get rid of sovereignty of nations to decide what's good for their own people. And they've been working at this for many generations, and move that authorization to global central command structures above anything that hard to get.
Get those agreements from as many countries as possible, and if that happens, that could be game over, I would think.
Well, that would definitely set history back quite a ways, yeah. And it's not just the World Health Organization. They've also been working the environmental, like the COP 20, 27, 26, all the way to COP 14. That whole thing is...
Wait. Recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. It stopped for a moment.
It's still recording. That's okay. That was weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird.
40 minutes.
Yeah, so they want to get that top-down imposition. And so far it's been thwarted on the climate side of things. They have wanted to shut down, carbon industrial civilization, decarbonize, and have these green globalist bodies from the top telling all of the nations how much they had to contract their population and consumption patterns in accordance with these ideas that, if we produce less carbon, we're going to make the world, become cooler or stop global warming by a factor of 1.5 degrees by 2050, which is all just make-believe. They're just making things up. But they're doing it for the effect of reducing population. So far, that's been thwarted by countries, mostly India, China, Africa, have stopped that from happening so far. But they've now been trying for the past 3 years to use the World Health Organization in another way, which so far, luckily, has been thwarted in the sense that there's been no legally enforceable mechanisms that have been permitted to be brought online, but they're still trying.
Okay, let me just take that a little into another area, which would be like, there's the BlackRock group that apparently has trillions of dollars at their command. And would you say that they are more or less calling the shots for everybody? Like, who controls the WEF, for example, and organizations like that? It seems like they're controlled by the people who have infinite amounts of money, seemingly, and they can do whatever they want with impunity.
Well, yeah, I mean, BlackRock is not themselves controlling. They're not a causal nexus. Like, if you look at Larry Fink, he's a World Economic Forum young leader. So in that sense, they've got. They have, as an institution, a role to play as a form of, mercenary on behalf of a master class. BlackRock itself is just that. It's like, it's a hedge fund. It's a bit of an everything operation, real estate. They're buying up all of so much real estate in North America. They're buying up Ukraine. They've got personal contracts with JP Morgan to, like, pretty much own all of the Ukrainian economy. much of Canada as well. Vanguard is another one. But again, they're just used as outfits to dominate and control. They're not themselves making the decisions or the policies.
Really? So who do you think
Yeah.
is making the decisions and for those kind of things?
Well, look, you got to look at, well, what is the World Economic Forum? And in that sense, like, you know, Klaus Schwab is another like cardboard cutout, a useful sociopath who was selected because he had the right stuff when he was a student under Henry Kissinger at Harvard back in the 1960s in a CIA-sponsored international program that Kissinger was teaching. Part of Kissinger's job was to simply look for talent, groom them, and give them assignments, his students, within the machine that he had sold his soul to a few decades earlier. You know, and Klaus Schwab fit the bill. He got a job, an assignment.
Yeah.
He was also groomed by another one of his twisted teachers named Maurice Strong, who he attributes to being his mentor, who was a co-founder of the World Economic Forum. Sort of the godfather of the modern Green New Deal, Maurice Strong, Canadian, sorry. And but both of them, Kissinger and Maurice Strong, were both Rockefeller agents as well. Maurice Strong was recruited when he was working in New York Rockefeller Center, and he became friends with David Rockefeller and was assigned a certain task to manage a bunch of petrochemical and coal mining industries in the late 50s. He became the head of Power Corporation of Quebec that ran at the time most of Quebec's power. Kissinger, early on, you know, he was a traumatized, nihilistic Nietzschean scholar who found himself very quickly immersed within CIA-funded operations in the 1950s around the same time as Maurice Strong. He soon found himself a member of the early Bilderberger group. And so, that gets us a little bit more at the causal nexus. So the Bilderberger group that was sort of the agency that was the senior controlling mechanism to what later became the World Economic Forum as a junior partner, of a lower level doppelganger of the Bilderberger groups.
Mm-hmm.
That was set up by Prince Bernhard, the former Nazi, to be a coordinating body meeting annually amongst people who were expected to become servants of the global agenda for world government. So again, you have to look at things like that if you want to get it, like, well, what is the controlling hand of these agencies that carry out the dirty work financially, like BlackRock or Vanguard or Goldman Sachs? You got to look at those entities.
Well, I was going to ask you another question that would be like, I've noticed that in a lot of your works, you promote the idea of sovereign nations, as opposed to the idea of the WEF, of eliminating that. And my question is, like, you're aware of the existence of what they call economic hitmen, right? Economic hitman is somebody who the CIA sends in an appointment with the leader of a country, and they offer them a big loan that they cannot pay back, and in that way they control the country. And if they refuse, they tell them that they will be murdered, and they are murdered. And so it's an easy way for them to control governments, to subvert governments and corrupt governments.
Yeah.
And as long as you have a vertical type of governing, it's the simplest thing for them to continue doing that. So that's what I'm wondering is, like, why do you put much faith in sovereign nations when, again, these people are not going to go away. They will be able to do the same thing they've done for centuries, just through raw intimidation, control a whole country. They don't have to have a war with it. So what would you say to that? That's why I believe in hierarchical, in horizontal governance.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that, like, I'm not ideologically an absolutist when it comes to sovereign nation states. Like, the way I look at sovereign nation states, within a context of universal history, and as you know, we've spoken before. I try to have I like context, and that means both in space and in time. So I try to keep as much of a wave of history as possible, as many thousands of years that my mind can research in some sketch in my mind. And what I've personally identified as an important causal nexus of the shaping of the contours of history is as you pointed out at the beginning, the yearning and actualization of impulses towards freedom of the both individual to express of the individual and of the collective at the same time, to express their actualize their higher potentials as creatures made in a divine way, right? That have these creative powers. They can only work if you have a spirit and a culture of love, of hope, of faith in the future, of self-knowledge, self-awareness. So if those cultural dynamics are there, and you have certain material conditions also generally being expressed, you're not insecure about whether you're going to have water tomorrow, or whether your baby's going to die of some unnecessary disease, like basic material conditions, right? Generally you will be able to be a better person every day of your life, and have more political freedom, all of these good things. So you have this other impulse against that, to try to pull us back into a situation of feudalism that's always been there since ancient times.
Right.
And that's based on a certain concept of human beings built around master-slave relations, a certain idea of a cosmology that's a fixed cosmology of a universe of decay, of nihilism. Ultimately,
Yeah, you'd
that
say
lends itself to nihilism.
there's these
So
two
anyway, you got these
themes running throughout history.
two themes,
right?
yeah, that dovetail, that create a sort of tension, and it's not Manichaean in that sense, because it's like it's not this idea that good has an equal balance to evil. I don't see that. I see that all there is good, but then you've got free will with humans that are animated by concepts that may or may not be right or wrong. And if they're wrong concepts with wrong passions that are associated with your concept of what you want to be as an elite born to rule over the many because you're just born to a better family with better stuff, you're going to create distortions, aka what some might call evil, especially if you're aware of the what's being done to satisfy your desires. If you're aware of it, so much worse than just being a fool. So anyway, part of that process I see as being the emergence of people who decided to organize themselves in a way that allowed them to do better and better forms of battle with this highly centralized parasitical oligarchy, which has always been this very central, internationally expanded force, utilizing similar techniques over thousands of years, maybe refining those techniques, but doing the same thing ultimately. And so in more recent times, coming out of feudalism, I see that the organization of ourselves in a harmonized way to carry out collective action against the oligarchy in our defense took the form of the nation state structure as a sovereign entity, especially coming with the period of the late 15th century, which grew a little bit more in 1648 with what put down or provided a way to kind of end the 30 years religious wars of Europe. But it was never perfect. It was never a finalized battle. The oligarchy didn't go away. They continued to find new ways of infiltration, subversion from within, as you pointed out, into the modern times with the economic hitmen as one component. So ultimately, in the broader sweep of things, I think that the nation-state structures were a stepping stone towards something much, much better. And in that sense, for me, I look primarily at culture, because what allows for a nation to become infiltrated and corrupted, one of the key things that we have as white blood cells to identify those points of decay and corruption is the cultural field. What do you have a culture that cherishes self-respect, the love of the future, the respect for the past, the caring of the whole that you're a part of? If you have a culture that encourages those things through better practices in the arts, in literature, in science, and the stories that we tell, then you're generally going to be able to create a situation whereby many Martin Luther King Jr.'s or Malcolm X's or John F. Kennedy's emerge. And if one is taken down, you have many people who are qualified to fill that vacuum and pick up the torch. Whereas when you don't, not only can you not really get very many such exceptional people who are willing to die for their principles, but if they do die, there's going to be fewer and fewer people who are qualified to then take up the leadership.
But when you say that, a lot of the cultures have really been contaminated with the toxic controllers for so many years, controlling the education and the whole thing, the whole culture, so that now we have a lot of people who are desperate and traumatized and crazy and all this kind of thing. So it's the cultures that
Bad.
might remain are very remote cultures, maybe in the jungle somewhere, who have like here in Ecuador, we have these indigenous tribes who do have these ancient cultures, and they're constantly embattled to maintain them because the government is doing everything possible to ruin them. And so that's another area of my activism here in Ecuador. But that's like you can't really depend on cultures anymore because of that. I think you have to have the generations that create a beautiful culture where you
Well,
have
I'm
beautiful
trying to
people.
here's the thing. So for many years of my political identity, I was very much only top-down thinking. I was much more, I had an underdeveloped appreciation for the necessity for bottom-up organizing, bottom-up
Hmm.
creative problem solving. I've increasingly over the last 4 or 5 years come to try to find that balance, and I'm still working on it. But I'm trying to. I've noticed that there's a problem of extremes in general, where some people try to do like what I used to do, which is always just think about abstract top-down solutions, and or inversely forget about top-down, only think bottom-up. And I think either one will tend to not provide a well-rounded, holistic approach. I think there
Well,
needs to be
yeah,
sort of
I mean,
a way to think
with
about both.
right, well,
Um,
horizontal doesn't mean that everything has to be horizontal. Like if you have a hospital, you can have somebody who is managing the hospital, or if you can have hierarchies within a horizontal if it seems like a good idea, But generally,
yeah,
it's
like you can't get
getting
around
away
that.
from.
You have students, you have little kids in a classroom. You're gonna have a teacher who's gonna know more than the kids, and that virtue of just the teacher
Yeah,
knowing more is going to be in a position to create a natural. There's natural hierarchies, and then there's unnatural hierarchies.
yeah.
And I think to find that balance of you're not going to let the kid necessarily decide everything that they want to do. They're just going to eat candy every day for supper.
Right.
It's
Well,
going to take a while for the kid to learn that, oh no, I should actually enjoy eating good food, and that takes a bit of time for that discovery to happen.
yeah, that's
But then
true.
that's the thing with freedoms, right? Like with real freedoms come responsibilities. It's not
Absolutely.
just, yeah.
Exactly. They go
um
together. Let
yeah
me ask you this. What where was it? What what do you think is the relationship between the mafia and the CIA? Do you have any
People,
ideas
if
on that?
anybody who wants to really know the answer to that one, I'll say my thoughts. But Whitney Webb has written
Oh
an
yeah.
incredible two-part volume series
Mhm.
called One Nation Under Blackmail. People
Yeah.
need to read that book series. It's really good. um yeah,
What is
it's
it?
it's
1,000
called,
pages or something, but it's
it's
worth
a
it, I
bit,
guess.
yeah, it's a bit broken up into two books.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
read well I read volume one and a little bit of volume two. I'm very impressed. Obviously, like, there's things I would criticize, but overall it's a really great introduction to the integration early on, going to the 20s, of intelligence agencies and mafia systems. Even earlier, she goes to the 1890s. um
Oh yeah.
so yeah,
No, I've
it's
seen her
they're
talks.
oh, you
I,
have? Yeah, they're good.
yeah. I saw
Yeah.
your interview with her, as a matter of fact, but also other ones.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, yeah. No, she's so
No,
bright.
no, she's
She's a
great. Yeah.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah. She really lays out the case nicely that these are two sides of one beast. They've never been two separate things. And whether it's Samuel Bronfman or the Bronfman clan that came in, they became, early on, many different families coming in from Europe at the beginning of the 20th century were tested. They were tested by those handlers who had created instruments to bring them in, whether it was from Italy, whether it was from Eastern Europe, and to create organized criminal activity as part of an operation that would um, facilitate the destruction of the culture as well as the maintenance of an international machinery that would be rooted in what was done to China effectively, and also India in the 19th century, into the Opium Wars. So the Opium Wars was sort of like the proto experiment, a laboratory, the first and second Opium Wars, that
Mhm.
created organized crime with British-controlled Hong Kong groups. This is where the triads come from, is throughout the fires of the Opium Wars, centered again in what the British ended up controlling for a century, Hong Kong after the Second Opium Wars, as a colony of Britain. Still to this day, it's called the CIA of the Pacific. And so what they did is they created a situation of dependence where in the late 19th century, or even, sorry, the late 18th century, India and China were the two most advanced countries economically in the world by a large magnitude, far more than Europe, far more than America. It was China number one, India number two. India was the global leader in textile manufacturing, architecture, arts. China, similar. I mean, it was quite progressive. That was destroyed by the British infiltration of both countries. What they recognized early on with their American loyalist counterparts in the United States, some of these Eastern blue blood, they called them Boston Brahmins, the American, upper crust families who were always loyal to the British East India Company and Foreign Office, never real Americans. They created a situation whereby they first destroyed India's textiles. They made it illegal for India effectively to even have textiles. They cut off the hands of Indian workers who were specialists, so that Britain would have full control and monopoly of textile manufacturing. India then would be able to make up for some of its lost revenue by producing opium, which was then sold to China. It was fed to China in order to destroy the spirit of the people. It was spiritual warfare, and create also organized corruption from all that infiltrated all the way up to the Qing dynasty courts of the higher command. So they got really good at that. And that's where HSBC, which today even is still at the heart of international narcotics trafficking, heroin trafficking, is still HSBC, a London-based, they call it Hongshang Bank of Commerce. It was set up in 1865 to organize and launder international drug money. It continued all the way through the 20th century doing the same thing to this very day. Like I said, it's still a huge force with other Canadian banks.
Okay.
So they did the same thing in America too. So they started organizing that template in America starting at the early 20th century. It worked very closely with the CIA, FBI, with Mayor Lansky, and it just did what it did, organizing terrorist activity, funding black budget operations to destabilize governments, other things. So, yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. If the oligarchs really control the United States government, why was there so much concern about Trump winning the presidency? Does it really matter much whether a Democrat or Republican sits in the White House?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, not in the sense of left and right politics. Democrats and Republicans, you see today, are converging. You got the traitors on both sides working together. Liz Cheney and Biden are all championing the exact same foreign policy. John Bolton, a Republican, is championing the war with both China and Russia and Korea and Iran and everything. So you got on both sides. Now in the Democratic Party, I think that since JFK and his brother Bobby were killed, there's been not a lot to work with. They were really selected much earlier on to be infiltrated and taken over by this virus to become an instrument of empire. But the same thing was being done throughout the Cold War with the Republican Party too. The Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln is a different Republican Party from George Bush Sr. or Jr. Now Trump wasn't really, when you look at the policies overall, it definitely was, it represented a wrench in the gears of a machine that was given a certain momentum and trajectory under Bush, Obama, and Hillary Clinton was supposed to carry on a certain orientation that was derailed in many ways under the Trump period. And I mean, the best thing that can be said about Trump is that he was not a willful traitor to his nation. He didn't want to destroy his nation, whereas I think other forces don't give a shit. They're perfectly happy overseeing, as long as they've got a good position in the feudal architecture. They're perfectly happy killing Americans. He didn't want to do that.
But how do you account for Trump supporting the vaccine thing?
Okay, so here's two things. So let's do a quick thing. As far as the vaccine thing, I don't know whether it's just I don't know if it's blank spots or whether it's intimidation. I'm not sure what that is. That is disastrously stupid. And I've openly come out criticizing him, as many people have. Now, it doesn't mean that I think that he was always a fraud. I just think that he really messed up there, and I don't know what the hell's going on in his world on that issue. What I do know is that he did pledge to defund, to take the U.S. out of the World Health Organization in 2020, and I see no evidence that he was lying on that point. He even started making big maneuvers to do that, to pull funding, and with a full takeout were he to be reelected. Number two, so in that sense, if you're not beholden to the World Health Organization, I know, like, he's not the draconian forced mandate type of person. He always fought against that, and he surrounded himself with Dr. Paul Alexander. If I look at a lot of the people who he brought in as specialists in opposition to Fauci, and I look at what they've been doing even after in the last 2 years, they're some of the best people who have been risking their lives fighting against this medical dictatorship ideology. So there's that stuff to keep that in mind. And there's things you do when you're playing the game, if you're actually in a position of power, and you're dealing with powerful evil forces that you have to navigate through and interface with, that it's difficult for me to put myself in the shoes of, I've never had power. So I'm sort of like trying to triangulate my mind on something I don't understand fully. So you got to keep that in mind. Yeah. The other thing too is, like, if I look at what Trump did consistently policy wise, and I've got a pretty solid mapping. I've actually made a documentary that's going to be released next week going through a lot of this. He took the U.S. out of its obligations to abide by anything NATO was doing. He was pulling the U.S. He basically destroyed the world, or the free. Hold on, I see my computer, my camera's going wacky. I just fixed it. Sorry about that.
You did fix it.
Yeah, he destroyed NAFTA's. The core of NAFTA was that it took the power from nation states away and gave it to private corporations, so nations couldn't use protectionism, direct credit, which is what he gave back to the power of nation states if they chose to use it to protect their native industries and agriculture. NAFTA had destroyed that completely. There's things he did that involved, working with Russia and China, forcing the U.S. military to work with Russia in Syria. He retracted 2/3 of the funding to the National Endowment for Democracy front groups that the CIA had been using for 35 years to overthrow governments they don't like. He also went to war with George Soros, and he called out the Federal Reserve. He called for breaking up the Wall Street banks with Glass-Steagall, but he was not given the support to do that. But he said it, and that was interesting. The other things too is he went with the idea of Arctic development to create a situation whereby Russia, China, and the U.S. would work to economically develop the Arctic instead of building missiles, which is what the current administration and Trudeau are moving towards in preparation for an attack on Russia from the north. He became friends with Kim Jong-un, which retracted the excuse that the U.S. military needed to have missile systems in South Korea pointed at Russia and China, using the idea that North Korea was loco. You couldn't work with them, and so you had to have a military presence in China's backyard. He ate cheeseburgers with Kim Jong-un and took away the idea that North Korea was a threat. He worked also to broker the U.S.-China trade agreement, which was derailed with COVID. But he, went to the Forbidden City, was given red carpet treatment with Xi Jinping and his wife. And China agreed to buy $200 billion of U.S. finished goods as part of a rehabilitation of the destroyed industrial base of Philadelphia, Detroit, and American agriculture, which desperately needed the China growth dynamic to justify the rehabilitation of those industries that had been consciously destroyed over 50 years of globalization. So that would have been a key part of that healing process. Again, COVID derailed most of this, unfortunately, and a bunch of, if I look at the amount of Soros, Malik Brown, Black Lives Matter, BLM, Antifa operations, which receive money from George Soros, the type of voting machine manipulation from things like Dominion, which were proven to be complicit in election fraud in the U.S., as well as Smartmatic, which it's somewhat tied to through George Soros's collaborator, Lord Mark Malik Brown, who used to manage Smartmatic and has run election fraud in South America, Asia, all over the world. It took on Dominion voting machines, took on the Smartmatic operating system back in 2007. There's so much effort that went into putting Biden and the whole Hillary Clinton machine back in power and overthrowing Trump that for me, the idea that he was a controlled opposition just doesn't hold up to the evidence of what I've seen over the 4 years that he was throwing wrenches to the New World Order machine. So as far as his support for vaccinations, that's the dumbest thing and it should be criticized and called out. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't.
Okay. But that's a good summary. I also, just to throw this in, because I don't want to take up too much time of your time and anybody who's watching this. You have anything to say about Robert Malone?
Yeah, well, my approach with Malone is I like to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think that Malone has said things that I support as far as his opposition to draconian vaccination mandates and things that are immoral on the medical dictatorship front. I think that's okay. There's certain things that I think are outside of his field of expertise that I think that it were wise that he probably should not be chiming in on in terms of his attempts to help people understand fifth generation warfare and controlled opposition and intelligence operations and the battle between, ideologies of Plato versus Aristotle, of which he says Plato is the evil one and Aristotle is the good one, and Jackson versus Hamiltonian systems of economics, which it's like, how did he become a specialist in all of these different fields? And China, and of course, why China is at the heart of the deep state. Bill Gates is an operative agent of China, and China has worked to single-handedly undermine Western democratic values. Like, where are you becoming an expert on all of these fields, and it's all equally, it smells of high-level intelligence agencies, while at the same time you are personally suing the Brevins, actual heroes who have spent decades successfully defending human beings against big pharma. And these are real American heroes who are being sued for $25 million. They're being destroyed by Malone because they criticized his use of mass formation psychosis. One of them is an actual trained psychiatrist. They didn't agree with how he used that term. They criticized it, and now $25 million. You're gonna destroy these people, while at the same time you're saying that anybody who treats any representative of the truth movement, the resistance, as being a controlled opposition is themselves. That's proof that that person who's making the accusation is controlled opposition. You're also declaring war on Peter McCullough, another very serious person. You're suing him too. There's a lot of weird things that I think Malone should probably pull back on and stick with what he knows. Otherwise, he's going to cause more damage and confusion than he he should.
Thank you for that. That's there's a lot of contradictions there. Are you concerned about surveillance and targeted individuals for your own life? You know about that.
I mean, I've come to terms with the fact that I live in Canada. It's part of the Five Eyes. I presume that, my personal privacy is not something I take for granted. Whether it's my devices, my phone, my computer, my TV, I don't know. I mean, I just gotta, be clear with what I'm saying that is in alignment with reason and conscience. What am I going to do?
Well, you could go to open source, so you could use alternative platforms, but you might not have the audience at this point. Actually, that's something we're working on, but it's not so simple. And so you can. Right now, we're taking our chances because this is public.
Yeah, I mean, look, I encourage people to use encryption. I have encrypted emails and things like that. To what degree it actually works, I don't know. But don't make it easy on them if you can avoid it. Try to, be smart about your communications.
And just to kind of wind down, because this is getting to be long. I don't know how long. Yeah, it's way long. Do you, so as far as like the events that are going on in the world, the major geopolitical things, the war and so many things, do you see that as a chaotic thing, or do you think that it's more or less it's controlled to a large degree? Do you think you understand?
I don't think there's some that are, and there's some that are controlled, and some things that aren't controlled in that sense. I think according to the original New World Order script that was being celebrated back in the early 90s with the dismantling of the Soviet Union, when Kissinger and Bush Sr. and Joe Biden were all championing, saying, hey, we've made it, it's the New World Order, hurrah. There was a sort of formula and script that was going to define the consolidation of residual resistance under a world government that was finally going to consummate itself. Very quickly. NATO was going to become global very quickly. It would become the sole, monopoly over nuclear arsenals, over military power. Banking was going to be fully controlled by the Bank of International Settlements, as the sort of the octopus head coordinating all of its tentacles. That didn't really turn out the way the ensuing 30 years actually played out. Things didn't go according to plan. So I think that according to the original program, they would have preferred that, Russia just remain under the Yeltsin 90s perestroika program. That would have been perfectly happy. They would have been happy with that trajectory. And, part of that involved Russia breaking itself up into like 13 micro federations of balkanized micro states with little ethno-nationalist dominant forces, because Russia has 83 different ethnicities in Russia. It's a huge place, and they wanted to sort of carve it up the way they did for the former Soviet space, and then create little mini conflicts between adjacent ethnic groups, right? Harvesting and cultivating you could always find pains of past generations that you could then bring to the present and induce hostility. That's the way they work. They had the same program for China. They would have preferred that China remain a sweatshop slave labor state the way it was designed in the 1980s when George Soros had his personal lackey as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in the 80s, before China woke up and kicked Soros out. They would have preferred that just be the forever model. Now, it didn't work out that way. Yeah. If it had worked out that way, I don't think they would have had a necessity of doing what they did with 9/11, with the Libya overthrow, with Iraq overthrow, with Syria, the current program, to do all of the chaos as part of asymmetrical warfare in the underbelly of Eurasia. They wouldn't have needed to do that because they would have had the dominance, and thus they would have lacked the fear of a rising Russia, China, and Iran relationship, which is what Samuel P. Huntington said would be the greatest threat to the New World Order, would be the only possible challenge. He wrote in 1997. No, sorry, not Huntington. This was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He said it would be the potential alliance of a Persia, China, Russia, civilizational dynamic. That's the only thing. He said, and we could never let that happen, which is why the Project for New American Century crowd that came in with Dick Cheney had formulated a whole plan for America in the world in the 21st century under U.S. hegemony, with the core rivals that had to be subdued: Russia, China, and Iran. So that was why, and that is now beginning to actually take a more mature relationship, especially in the last 7 or so years, under the Belt and Road Initiative, the different systems that have been put online with the BRICS Plus, that is now seducing, or at least creating an alternative for countries that have formerly been playing a very nasty role within the machine, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, who are all ultimately realizing that they are flushable, expendable assets. They're not essential. And the only way they're going to survive the coming storm is to go to countries that actually don't want to flush them, and want to help them develop their real economies, instead of just being, supporters of terrorism and oil speculation. So you have a new center of gravity that is much more, I think, healthy as far as the long-term survival interests of the species, which is forcing certain decisions to be made around, like what we're seeing with this absurd policy in Ukraine, in the U.S. military-industrial saber rattling in the Pacific. Either Taiwan, Japan, South Korea are all being used to create a NATO of the Pacific. Japan has gotten rid of its pacifist constitution, as increasingly has Germany, which is being remilitarized again in preparation for a war both with Russia and with China. And a lot of effort to try to destabilize Africa as a continent too. There's a battle over Africa. Same thing for South America too, right? There's a big battle over what direction South America or Latin America with the CELAC countries are going to go. lot of intimidation by the World Bank figures that want to keep them in the cage. So I don't know. But
Okay.
in that sense, I hope you know what I'm saying. Like, kind of it is planned, and kind of some of it's not planned. It's
Yeah, you can't plan it. Yeah, there's always going to be that, but there is the reality that after 100 years of having this wet dream of controlling all of humanity from the eugenicists and Nazis from
Yeah.
early 1900s and before, that now it seems they have everything in order to do it with the control of the American military, the CIA, the media, the money. They have all. They have. It seems like they have everything they need to do it, and it's kind of a.
Materially they have like a lot of power with the military systems, but if you look at the mediocrity culturally, like they've gotten to a point of such decadence and decay that they can't really the best people that they could find to be their warriors, their mercenaries of the technocracy and of the military are transgender fanatics who are all into post-truthism, like Schultz. If you look at Schultz, he's actually stressing not only about the oncoming war with Russia that Germany is supposed to be doing as a slave colony, but he's like trying to figure out what woman can we get to fill the spot of defense minister of Germany, who's going to be in charge of military policy, because we have to balance our executive with equal male-female representation. That's his priority, is balancing male-female representation. And it's like, even if you were serious about carrying out a fight with Russia, which is absurd, but I'm just saying, if you were serious, you would find who's most qualified, not like which woman. So they're purging the military of people who actually had competence to do things because they weren't in conformity. They either didn't want to get injected with experimental drugs, or they didn't want to adapt to all of these other weird ethics. So you don't really, and they've expended most of they've used up all of their cards in this disaster of Ukraine, which according to their original plan was supposed to end a lot earlier, with Russia defeated economically early on last year. Russia was supposed to be destroyed according to the computer models they were using. There was expected to be a Russian oligarch coup d'etat against Putin, which John Bolton and others had been celebrating and cultivating. That didn't happen. They had the same thing where they were hoping that the Western-leaning leaders in China were going to overthrow Xi Jinping. That didn't happen. So it's like nothing has really been working according to the plan, especially since Libya was overthrown.
Do you have some insider information to know all of that, or how do you know that?
I look at think tank reports. I follow a lot of garbage media messaging to see like what they're putting out. I look at RAND reports, which is very useful to read since RAND is sort of at the heart of a lot of the foreign policies. If you want to know what the U.S. policy is going to be next year, look at what RAND reports are producing this year. And or Brookings Institute as well is a useful one to look at.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
That's nice to know. Listen, I could be talking to you for a long time with so many questions, but I don't think it's fair to do that. So let me just end with one last question, which would be, what is the single most important message that you would like to share with the viewers?
I think that's a great way to end it. I think that with every major crisis is an opportunity to self-inspect, to look at both the world outside of us and the world inside of us at the same time, to think about what caused this to happen, what sorts of normalized folly was permitted, was accepted, and tolerated as we became worse.
Wait, let me interrupt you there for a second, because I want to make the point that to really understand what's going on, or to understand even a person, you have to know their history, and that's why you are so valuable to everyone, because you provide that history that people don't know. Otherwise, you just have a superficial understanding of things, or you propagandized by the media. So it's so important. But go ahead. I just want to throw that in there.
That's sweet of you. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I that's the know thyself, right? Know history of as much as you can of the world you're a part of the people, the collective community that you are but a part of, essential part of. And then at the same time as you're looking at the times that we got better and the times that we got worse, even before we were born, try to take those lessons and look at the times you got better and the times you got worse in the course of the lives that, while we've been experiencing here on Earth. Try to see ourselves as a bit of a microcosm of the species in that sense, and look to every time that we've gotten better from a time that we've gotten worse in our lives. What were we doing? What were the psychospiritual, the way of thinking, the way of feeling, and try to make that more of the focus and understand that goodness better as we redefine what we want to be in the future, looking back on ourselves in the present and thinking, okay, do I see myself in next year, 5 years, 20 years, towards the last days of my life, as being as do I look back upon my present self as being something I'm proud of, or like, how do I want to be myself? How do I want to be seen, felt by my kids, my grandkids, historians, thousands of years in the future, looking at the world in the present? Did the world in the present go bad or go good because of what I did or didn't do? Like, think of yourself from multiple angles like that, and it'll generally get better. You will become ever. What I can say is I have no guarantees about where the world is going to go in our lifetimes, but I do know that we will be in harmony with the laws of the universe in that sense, which is good for the conscience, good for the mind, good for creativity.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think we both agree that if people could really know themselves better, they would really be pushing for a world that's based on caring for other people, or, in a word, love. And
Amen.
So that's kind of a hard thing to pull off. So we have to hope that they'll do it on their own, I guess. So thanks so much, Matt, for a great interview. I really appreciate it. I hope we can have some more in the future.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. It's always a pleasure.
Okay.
All right. Bye, Tom.
Yeah.